Hey everyone, I want to share a few clips, a few excerpts from an interview at the ARC conference in London that took place last week. And in this clip, Konstantin Kisin is interviewing Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And if you don't know Ayaan Hirsi Ali's story, I've talked about her on this channel before. She escaped a forced marriage. She grew up in Somalia. She grew up under both Islamism and a kind of tribal authoritarianism in Somalia. And she became one of the most important voices in the West on what civilization actually requires to function, and one of the greatest voices warning the West about the dangers of Islamism that is encroaching on all of our societies. And what struck me about this conversation is that she's describing in very simple language from lived experience, something that I've been talking about on this channel. I've gotten away from it in the last few weeks when we've been really in the weeds of the Middle East, but I want to get back to it. And there's one moment in one of these clips, I think it's in the second clip, where she basically describes the very essence of what humanity is according to the Bible, even though she doesn't say it that way. And it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden in Genesis, as I will explain. So there's going to be a little bit of a Bible study in this video as well. So I want to walk you through a few clips. We're going to do 3 clips and my comments on them. So stick around for the whole thing. All right, here we go. Let's pull up the first clip. Bear with me. Here we go. Clip 1.
As I lived in the Netherlands, I became acquainted with the concept of church or religion, and people would worship God freely, and if they didn't want to worship, they didn't worship. I didn't have that choice growing up. I had to worship, and my relationship with God was centered around fear. Schools, again, very impressed with the concept that school was really for imparting knowledge and forming character. In both communism and Islamism, school really was for indoctrinating children. Really stealing, kidnapping other people's children and indoctrinating them. I remember I was a translator, interpreter, and I remember translating for, in many different institutions. One of them was a school, and the Somali child had beaten the Dutch child, and the Dutch teacher was trying to explain to the Somali mother, your child cannot do this. And she said, but I did say to him, hit him if he teases you or if some child bothers you. And that, for me, puts on a crucible the country and the societies that I came from, where you use brutal strength, violence, to stop someone else from being violent. And the Dutch teacher explained and said there are other ways of doing things. To move very quickly, small businesses. People sold and bought things and freely. And, again, I know there were lots of complaints in the Netherlands about not just the existence of small businesses, but how they do. But I just remember the little shops, the little kiosks that we had in Mogadishu, in Ethiopia, everywhere where I was, they lived in terror of the state. People would come and take their stock. If their goods were stolen, you didn't call a policeman, because a policeman was not someone you trusted. He represented the state, and that was someone you feared. And I thought it was astonishing for me living in the Netherlands to find policemen that you called for help.
Okay, we'll pause it there. So notice what she's describing. Again, she grew up under both Islamism and Marxism, because that's what Somalia was or is. And she's not just talking about good institutions versus bad institutions, right? Think about the construct where she's talking about the schools and about the police and about the way the system works. So I've talked about this before. Do we order society? Is power and authority in society bottom up or top down? Right? In a free society that believes in a free country where citizens have rights, that's where power stems from. So in the civilization she escaped to, the West, the policeman exists to protect you. The school exists to develop you. Authority whatever authority is, it's an instrument that exists for the sake of the individual, and it receives its authority, it receives its power from the individual citizens. The individual has worth that comes before the institution and outranks it. In the civilization she escaped from, that's inverted. And I want to be precise about this. See, Islamism and communism get to the same place through two different routes, but they end up in the same place functionally. Okay, I'm actually doing some writing on this. Hopefully it's going to turn into a book. I'll keep you guys updated as that progresses. But think about this. Track with me here. Islam means submission. The whole structure of Islam is that the individual submits to the will of Allah. It's not a covenant. Okay, it's a submission. And in practice, that means you're also submitting to whoever's interpreting and enforcing the will of Allah here on earth. The individual doesn't have independent standing. His role is to comply. So of course, school exists to teach compliance, basically, to indoctrinate rather than develop. The child isn't there to become himself. He's there to become a properly submitted, compliant servant of the system. Of course, the policeman isn't there to protect you. He's there to enforce compliance, right? Marxism gets to the same place through different reasoning. There's no submission to a divine will because they're atheists, but there's a submission to history, to the collective. You are not, you're subsumed in the goals of the collective. You don't have individual free choice about how you're going to live your life. The revolution, the cause. The individual is not the basic unit that matters. That's not where authority derives from. That's not where power derives from. It doesn't derive bottom up. It's top down. The class, the party, the cause, that's what matters. The individual is only valuable to the extent that he serves those things. So again, the school exists to produce a usable instrument of the system. The policeman exists to protect the state, not you. It's so there's two completely different metaphysics here between Marxism and Islam. One's explicitly atheist and the other one is, Allah, but they land at the exact same structure, architecture, if you will. The individual exists to serve the system, not the other way around. And this is not a minor cultural difference between our civilization and theirs. It's the difference between a civilization that believes that every person bears the image of God and therefore has a worth, as an inherent worth that no system can assign or revoke, and has an individual relationship to that God, a covenantal relationship that implies responsibility on both sides. Right? That's the biblical model. And then you have Marxism and Islam that, for different reasons, believe that the individual is raw material that is meant to submit to something bigger than himself, right, to the cause, and is not significant as an individual. All right, let's go to clip number 2. I hope that made some sense. Let's go to clip number 2. Here we go.
When I lived in Somalia and in Saudi Arabia and in Ethiopia and all of these places, and we sat down and we asked ourselves, why is life so terrible? What are we getting wrong? We used to scapegoat freely. It's the Jews who did it. It's the Westerners who did it. Something was always happening to us as a collective. We never took individual responsibility because we weren't allowed to be individuals. Here you have a society that nurtures the individual, and you become an individual, you become responsible, you are held accountable, and we've built institutions that are geared towards this. And I think that it's time now to rescue our institutions from these bad ideas.
Okay. This is the clip I want to spend the most time on. I think that here, Ayaan Hirsi Ali just gave us, without knowing it, the best modern illustration of the oldest story in the Bible. Listen to what she says. She says, we never took individual responsibility because we weren't allowed to be individuals. So we went to scapegoating. blaming others, right? Blaming the Jews, blaming the West, right? Blaming the oppressor, blaming the rich, blaming, right? Something was always happening to you, to them, right? Nothing that they weren't choosing. Now, I want to take you back to Genesis chapter 3, and that's the chapter of the sin in the Garden of Eden, the original sin, as it's often called. Now, right after they eat from the tree, God confronts Adam, and he says, "Did you eat from the tree that I told you not to eat from?" Now, Adam doesn't say, "Yes, I did this." He doesn't just say it like that. He doesn't deny it, but he doesn't say, "Yes, I did this." He says, in effect, "Hey, the woman that you gave me gave it to me." He blames her. And then when God turns to the woman, she says, "Well, it was the serpent. It was the snake that convinced me." Meaning neither of them takes responsibility. Think about that. That's their reaction. And I believe that that's key to the whole sin. The sin isn't just that they ate. The sin is that they did not take responsibility. And that has to do with the punishments they get. I'll get to that in a minute. But each of them, Adam and Eve, each finds someone else to blame. She's not even called Eve yet. She's called the woman at that point. And I want to add a piece to this that most people, including most people who know the Bible, never really notice or think about. Genesis chapter 2, which comes right before the sin, Genesis chapter 2 is what we call the second creation story, where you have Adam being created, and then God says it's not good for him to be alone, and then does that whole thing where he takes out the tsela, which is usually translated as his rib, and creates the woman and brings the woman to Adam. That's Genesis chapter 2. But Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 3 is the sin and the punishments for the sin, we have them as two different chapters. But that division into two different chapters is a Christian textual convention. The Christians who divided up the chapter numbers that we all use, Jews as well, again, that's how they're the ones who chose the chapters. But if you look in the Hebrew Masoretic text, if you look in a Torah scroll where it's just how it was originally written and there's spaces periodically, and those spaces are not just chapter divisions, but often divisions based on subject, or there's various reasons for those. But certainly at a chapter break, you're going to have a space. There's no space between those two narratives, between the creation of Adam and Eve and the sin. It's all what we call Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 are all one continuous passage in a Torah scroll. There's no break between these two stories in the original text. So think about that. That means that the creation of Adam and Eve, with the rib and all that, bringing Eve to the man, and then the sin after it is all one story, which is introduced with the line that this is the story of the creation of man, which is chapter 2, verse 4, because the first 3 verses of chapter 2 are about the Sabbath. They really belong at the end of chapter 1. That's a different subject. Let's keep this simple. The story of the creation of Adam and Eve and the story of the sin in an original text of the Bible are actually one continuous story. Why is that important? I think it's huge, because the way most people read the story is that man was created perfect, and then there was this tragic fall, an interruption of something that was complete. But if you read it as one unbroken unit, what you realize is that the sin was not an interruption of the creation story. It's written as part of the creation story. It's the conclusion of the creation of man. And look at what happens at the very end of that account. Adam names his wife. She's initially called Isha, woman, but then only after the sin and after the punishments does Adam give her a new name, and she now is called Chava, Eve, which in the text it says because she is the mother of all life, the mother of all life. She's, for the first time, it refers to the procreation to reproduction, to being a mother, to them being parents. Before that moment, throughout the entire story, she's simply called Isha. So the name Mother of All Life, the name that marks her as a fully realized human being who can now generate and nurture the next generation, only comes after the sin, after the confrontation, after they're forced to face what they did, take responsibility for it, feel ashamed for it. You only feel ashamed if shame is the beginning of taking responsibility. It means you recognize what you did wrong. So in other words, let me sum this up. You'll see where I'm going here. Man and woman are not finished, fully formed human beings when they're created at the beginning of Genesis 2. They only become finished, fully formed human beings where they become Adam and Chava, mother of all life, ready for parenthood, ready to build a family, ready to build a future. They only reach that point once they have passed through this crucible, this test of choosing, failing, being ashamed, suffering the consequences, taking responsibility. That all is what happens in the sin scene. Responsibility isn't a lesson tacked onto the creation story. It's not afterwards. Responsibility is part of the creation story. That's where the human being is fully formed. I know this is different than the standard Christian way of understanding original sin, but that's what's in the text. And what Ayaan Hirsi is describing is that same concept, that the avoidance of responsibility, what we see Adam and Eve doing at the beginning, and God rebukes them and God gives them punishments and he gives them responsibility. Think about the punishments. Eve's punishment is that, if you give in to desires, if you bring the man into giving into desires, you're going to be in a compromised situation, and there's going to be pain and suffering that you go through. You're going to be weakened. You're going to have burdens as a result of that, the pain and suffering of childbirth. Think of what Adam is given. Oh, you're going to have to be a responsible person. You're going to have to work for a living. You're going to have to be able to support her. They now have responsibilities. And there's now trials and tribulations and suffering that goes along with responsibility. And that's what civilization is built on. And they're individuals. The Bible begins with individuals who have to take responsibility. Collectivist systems, whether it's Islamist or communist, like what Ayaan Hirsi grew up with, they give you a permanent exit from taking responsibility. As she said, we never took responsibility because there's always a bigger force to blame. You can blame your class position. You can blame the colonizers, the infidels, the will of Allah, which you only have to submit to. You don't reason about it. Right? In the Bible, Moses and Abraham argue with God, right? You don't argue with Allah. The difference between biblical civilization and the systems that Ayaan Hirsi lived under is what happens in the Bible, that the instinct to blame is not accepted by God. They blame others. God rejects that, and he gives them these consequences that force responsibility that they were trying to avoid. And once they've accepted responsibility, now they can be parents. Now the woman becomes Chava, mother of all life, right? And that's the creation of the human being, a mature human being worthy of the term human being, worthy of being responsible and making choices, is now fully complete because they understand consequences and responsibility. It's like a kid growing up. If you have a kid that never has messed up and has never suffered consequences, doesn't understand responsibility, yeah, they're pure and pristine, but they're not, that they're not really ready for life. So communism and Islamism never get past the blame stage. Their whole thing is based on it. They institutionalize it. The Jews did it. The West did it. The infidels did it. The rich did it. There's always a bigger force, and the individual never has to become responsible because the system never makes you take responsibility. You have an enemy who's at fault. Biblical civilization insists that you are not just reacting to forces around you. You are a soul. You choose. You're accountable. And it's only by embracing that accountability, not by avoiding it, that you become a complete human being. So what I'm pointing to is that what she's pointing out in terms of the difference between how authority was viewed and responsibility and individuality, how all of that is viewed in these communist and Muslim cultures, is speaking to something very, very deep. The biblical foundations of Western civilization are what give us our whole concept of responsibility, of accountability, of individuality, of how society is ordered at a very, very comprehensive level. It goes far beyond what we call religion. Okay, well, let's do one more clip from this. This will be, let's find clip number 3. Here we go, clip number 3.
The Christian story, the Western civilizational story, has the remedy for that. It is built into the system. There was someone, I'm blanking on his name right now, but who did write about once upon a time we used to fear God, and now we've come to fear, and fill in the blanks. And I think to go back to that fear of God, we were checked by these biblical truths. We were checked by, into every institution, some form of accountability was built into it. And what we did was remove these layers of accountability by labeling them white supremacist structures that had to go, and slowly shifted towards...
You're my favorite white supremacist, by the way.
They've been calling me white supremacist for a long time.
I know.
But if accountability is white supremacy, and if individual responsibility is white supremacy, then I want to be a white supremacist. But obviously that's not what it is. It is all these accusations, these blithe, superficial accusations have been found to be effective. They work on you. And if you respond to it, then it becomes easy to smuggle in these bad ideas and you can have no pushback. And I think the self-criticism, the critical thinking, the self-reflection, the accountability, the responsibility, these are the pillars that made the West different. And I think any time you make the unit of well-being, you shift it away from the individual to the group, you are going to have problems. And
wow, so powerful. I think you should find the whole thing. It's online. Ayaan, Hirsi, Constant Kiesin at the ARC conference, ARC in London. You should watch the whole clip. I want you to notice what she does here. She doesn't refer to Western values. She refers to biblical truths, not liberal values, biblical truths. She makes a joke about being called a white supremacist for believing in accountability and individual responsibility. Now, it's funny, but I actually want to unpack why that accusation exists, because, it's not just an insult. Oh, you're a white supremacist when you insist on accountability. There's actually a recognition in that insult, in that accusation, even if it's hostile, of exactly the thing that this whole video has been about, that I'm talking about in this video. If your worldview says, how do I put this? If your worldview says that the individual is not really the basic moral unit, that the real units that matter are groups, classes, where you are on the oppressor versus oppressed, where you are in that structure, then the idea that you personally are responsible for your choices is a threat to that system. Because if I can hold you individually accountable, I can no longer explain your failures as purely in terms of the system that produced you. Individual responsibility is a threat to the entire Marxist. And when I say Marxist, I'm talking also about neo-Marxism and all of this woke stuff, right? I'm a threat to that entire construct. I'm a threat, and Islam also sees it as a threat. Right? Individual responsibility breaks that narrative. That the narrative that everything bad that happens to you is really the fault of structures, history, power, or even everything bad that you do is the fault of structures, of history, of power, of others. It puts, and when we talk about individual responsibility, putting the moral weight back on you, the individual, I mean, that's a threat to that whole system. So when accountability gets relabeled, or it gets called white supremacy, what's actually happening is there's an attack on the one trait that makes self-government, self-correction, introspection, and civilizational growth possible. The willingness to say, I was wrong, the willingness to take responsibility. This brings us back to Genesis 3. Once you've convinced people that asking, what did I do wrong and how do I fix it, is itself a, that's a white supremacist way of thinking, crazy, or it's a biblical idea that's being imposed on you. So then you're back at the blame game, the blame shifting that she describes, that she experienced in growing up in the Muslim and Marxist world. It's the woman blaming the serpent and the man blaming the woman and blaming God for giving him the woman. The serpent deceived me. The system constructed me. I was forced into this. It's not my fault. The people put around me, the people that God put around me, the system around me is what forced me to behave this way. That's what's happening there when, in the blame game in Genesis 3. It's an exit from responsibility. So Ayaan Hirsi Ali talks about what's been under attack: self-criticism, critical thinking, self-reflection, accountability, individual responsibility. These are, as she says, are the pillars that make the West different. But they're not just Western values, right? They are the fruit of a specific theological, biblical claim about what a human being is. That you are a soul in the image of God. You choose, and you are accountable. But if you take that away, then you lose all the pillars of the society. So it's fascinating that Marxists and Islamists reject, both of them for different reasons, reject the Bible as the key document that underpins civilization. It's fascinating. So here's what I want you to take away from this. Ayaan Hirsi Ali lived in these two systems that strip the individual of responsibility and bury the individual in the collective. She lived in and then she lived in a third system. She lived in the West, the biblically founded West, that insists that you are an individual who chooses. You're not just pushed around by forces bigger than you or defined by them. And this is Genesis. This is the Bible. This is the oldest story we have. And it's still the truest one. Anyway, I hope you found this useful. Hope you found it interesting. I hope it was enlightening to you in some way. Let me know what you think of this. A little different than a lot of the geopolitical stuff we do here. But these are topics that we need to talk about. I'd like to get back to doing them more. Let me know your thoughts on this. All right, God bless.